So in this video, we interview Dr. Kumaran Rajaram, who is a senior lecturer at the College of Business in Nanyang Business School's Division of Leadership, Management and Organization. Dr. Rajaram is also a research fellow with the Center for Research and Development in Learning and specializes in learning analytics, organizational learning and development, management education, and the culture of learning and internationalization of higher education. We're going to talk to Kumaran about his book, which was published with Springer this year, 2021, entitled Evidence-Based Teaching for the 21st Century Classroom and Beyond, Innovation-Driven Learning Strategies. The book provides fascinating insights into technology-enabled learning that engage and facilitate collaborative and cooperative learning. Thank you, Kumaran, for agreeing to talk to us about the book. And I'd just like to start by offering you a chance to talk about some of your background. You've had a lot of time in industry as a CEO. What did you learn about effective communication?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. It's been a privilege and I'm happy to be here sharing my insights. Thank you for the introduction. Now, back in my corporate stint, one of my appointments has been a CEO for a consulting firm, basically looking at Southeast Asia region. So I'm responsible for Southeast Asia region. And the question is targeted specifically on effective communication. So as a person, as a top leader, as a senior leader for the organization that oversees more than a few hundred people, right? One of the key things is the ability to be clear, understanding your employees as well as what you want, what you intend to articulate. So let me talk about the ability of looking at the bigger picture in a strategic goals or vision for the organization and translating those goals clearly to your head of departments across different divisions. And then that would be triggered down to the employees. So in my reflection of learning, being a senior leader, is the ability to make sure that I use proper channels. How do I make difficult, challenging concepts easy so that I will be able to trickle this down to the employees on the ground? So I tend to think, number one, what are some of the modalities, or rather the channels I use? What would then be effective? For example, right, a town hall meeting where I open up, I invite everyone sometimes not everyone, but representatives in different departments. So they are given voice to voice out their concerns, for example, right? Clarifications, for example. So that channel allow me to engage not only the head of departments, but some of the concerns on the ground. So when I articulate, sometimes there is the gap of clarity, for example, right? Perhaps they may not understand. So for me, communication is the ability of us to be agile. Another key point that I would like to highlight is the culture aspect. And I'm mindful of who are the profile of people, employees I have. I have probably, if my count is correct, I would have more than employees from more than maybe 20 countries around Southeast Asia and beyond. Now that means I need to be able, and I cannot assume that one way of communicating makes sense because their value system and how they look at things are different. So I tend to be mindful and I learn, right, together with my team of how then the message gets to the ground effectively. So 2 points I would like to highlight, despite the fact there are many. Number one is clarity. How do you reach them using different channels? Today, we need to be mindful that, are we going to use a particular channel that is engaging, open up in verbal or written, email, or even some creative ways of creating our own social media kind of channels? That's number one. Number two, culture. And to me personally, this is a very important aspect because how well can you make sure that the message goes out clearly to your employees as well as your tactical leaders?
Thank you. Yeah. What pedagogical approaches using technologies and learning innovations do you think will be applied in future generations to students in teaching?
Sure. Now, when we talk about pedagogical innovations, or rather bringing in technology, the very first thing that comes to my mind is, and we all know that we are from different specializations. For example, in a university, you may be from School of Law, School of Medicine, Center of Language, for example, School of Business. So the way and the subject matter may differ. Now, so that means you must be able to understand what is effective for you and try to bring in the technology to assist your pedagogical aspect instead of putting the technology at the front. So it means, specifically, we must be able to understand the pedagogical design first and what then help. Let me give you specific examples from my experience. I'm from School of Business. So one of the very important things is about the ability of students to think beyond knowledge, developing their skill set and competency. So in that specific aspect, I have used flipped classroom as one of the pedagogical aspects, one of the many pedagogical aspects. And then when they come to the class, I tend to look around and see what technology intervention or innovations out there in the market is appropriate, such that what is my goal? For example, I want them to make sure they interact collaboratively in class, intergroup, intra-group, for example, and peer review. So there are many out there, applications out there, technological apps, for example. But the point is that what are you trying to achieve in the class? For example, you want to do a peer review. So what are the apps out there that assist to make sure that it contextualizes to what you are teaching, if it is not 100% close to what you're doing? Now, if we go in that direction, and I think leveraging on those technological aspects kind of makes sense.
And how does that compare to the traditional classroom?
Right. So in a traditional classroom, for example, we go in there, and obviously as educators, we would like to transfer as much knowledge as possible to our students. With that enthusiasm and passion, sometimes we don't understand, we probably be overwhelmed of giving them too much of information of what we want to give them. So comparatively to blended classroom, for example, and flipped classroom, for example, these are two of the many pedagogical aspects, where if we are able to move the contents outside the classroom, so they learn outside the classroom, the contents, the necessities, and they bring in questions while going through online learning, reflection journals, and they bring in questions in the class. So what do you do in the class? You actually address their questions, recap their concepts, have dialogues with them. I think the value add is really about the 3 hours or 4 hours that you have with the students. How are you able to make them think, number one? How are you able to make them resonate and ask questions, number two? How are you able to make them collaborate among themselves so that they actually have different perspectives before there's a class discussion? So the difference, coming back to your question, is that what's the difference between traditional classroom and flipped or blended classroom, for example? Is the ability of us to give the power shifted towards the students, so the students are able to be more engaged. Not only that, but is to enhance their learning process.
I think that a lot of us hear terms like blended and flipped classrooms, or blended learning and flipped classrooms, but many of us don't really know the difference between those. Is there a big difference?
Yes, that's a very important question, Mark. Thanks for asking that. Let me distinguish, despite the fact that there are some overlaps between the term flipped classroom and blended learning approach, let me give you some distinctive differences. Let me touch on flipped classroom. So in a flipped classroom, you shift the entire contents that you intend to teach in that particular lesson outside the classroom. So for example, that contents can be in animated videos. The contents could be partially in articles, for example. Now, so they actually do an online lecture, perhaps nearly to that, outside the classroom. And when they come to the classroom, we actually have applied activities. We have dialogues, interactivity. We don't repeat the contents, right, of the lecture in the classroom. So that is for flipped classroom. So when we move to blended learning approach, what happens here is that you still want to do a traditional kind of lecture to a certain extent in the classroom, but you supplement, right? You supplement your lecture, right? Of perhaps maybe you want to do a 3/4, 50% of the lecture, but supplement, right, of whatever you're going to do outside the classroom, right? For example, specifically, you want to touch on a very complex concept of an X theory. And you know very well that you may not have the bandwidth to explain, because once you start explaining it, you may take at length, and that may overarch into other concepts. So you want them to have a reading, for example, a succinct reading of half a page, or perhaps a video that enables them to visualize before the classroom. That is going to help that educator or teacher in the classroom very well, because when the students come into the classroom, you kind of level them up at a higher level, and then you kind of progress very fast. So that's the distinctive difference, if I may put across, by and large.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a clear distinction, isn't it, between the two? Thank you. Yeah. In the book as well, you talk about using social media for learning. I think that this is something that, you know, very few of us actually do, although we do have, all of us, access to that resource. You talk about how you can use Facebook as a collaborative and experiential pedagogical tool. Would you mind sharing with us like an example of how you've used it before?
Sure, thanks, for sure, Mark. Now, let me touch on there are many social media tools out there, right? So perhaps Facebook is one that has been used, but I tend to always look at what is current, what is relevant, what is more contemporary. But let me go back and perhaps take one step and start off with emphasizing what is this all social media about? How can we connect these social media tools out there to educational learning? The leveraging point is really about the ability of us to shift from a kind of a very traditional mindset into a perspective of what the students can relate or resonate to. What are some of the features within the social media, whatever social media that you're using? I'm going to give you an example of how I tend to use Facebook as one of the many tools or social media tools I use. But before that, it's about the ability to understand what resonates with students. How can you actually make it in terms of the social aspect rather than a very rigorous kind of a monotonous kind of a traditional thing? So what do you break off? You break off to bring the students on board and try to engage them, right? Try to engage them in that aspect. So for Facebook, as an example, what happens is that you can create an in-group. Right? So there are a couple of features of likes, comments that they can actually make. And this can be done in real time. And most, if not all of them, will have a Facebook account, and they tend to always do on a social aspect. Right? So I leverage on that because Facebook is something that they actually is part and parcel of their life, on a personal aspect. But can we turn that into a learning? For example, in some of the topics, leadership, for example. So what I ask them to do is to find a video related to a concept that I'm teaching, and then the YouTube link, and then post it there. And the rest of the groups would tend to comment on that, and they would comment. And automatically, people tend to, even the introverts, tend to come in and make some comments. Now, this can happen real time. This can happen offline, depending on what is your design. There's no mandatory aspect. But the point that I want to bring across is that how do you connect to the students? How do you connect to the students? Perhaps we have to change. We have to be agile. Facebook may no longer be the best tool anymore. And I'm talking about when I was doing the research on this before I read the book 3 years ago, 2-3 years ago, but perhaps even now it can be used, but there are more contemporary tools like Instagram, for example, TikTok, for example. Right now, TikTok has been the trend, and I tend to leverage on TikTok, on videos effectively, so that it kind of make that link to the students, and you're able to even push boundaries further.
So with this use of, you know, social media resources, would this fit in with your idea of providing more student-centric learning through active and experiential learning? Or are there other methods as well that you use to try to facilitate a student-centered pedagogy?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think that's a very important aspect as well. How do we shift from a teacher-centric to student-centric? And that's very important because we are giving them a voice. And learning is about making them speak, making them think, making them write. I mean, it could be in many different forms, but the ability of us to do that. So whatever we are talking about is the platform's interventions. So starting from social media, yes, that's one aspect, real time, that we could use. What other methodologies do I use with technology or without technology? As I say, technology doesn't, it must not come in front to force feed, but it kind of complementary to what you are intending to in terms of pedagogical design. So for example, I use experiential and active learning quite a bit. And I do that differently in different lessons. For example, when I say student-centric, one of the very powerful things in at least management and leadership is about case studies, number one, right, where they interact. And I'm talking about case studies which is not on a traditional aspect. I'm talking about case studies tagged with interviews with practitioners, real life people, for example, interviews with them, so they can resonate contemporary what people are talking about. It is then tagged to perhaps visualization, for example, a manufacturing firm. How does a manufacturing firm value chain looks like? So they really can see, not on paper, but really visualizing that. And then contemporary articles that comes together with the topic you're teaching. For example, newspaper articles of contrary views and comes in. So they are given this aspect of contemporary aspect as real time. It's something that can real time. That's one aspect of case study. I do role plays, for example, and role plays are very powerful because they get into their roles of managerial roles and they actually negotiate. Sometimes, right, if bandwidth allows, right, especially pre-COVID, I bring in industry partners to be panelists. For example, in retail industry or F&B industry. So there'll be two people, they come in, they give 10 minutes of advocate, they sit in the panel, they watch one role play, and they give feedback directly. Now, this is very powerful because students tend to listen to practitioners as much as they want to listen to us, but they know that this is real. And that becomes very powerful as well. The last not least, I would also like to emphasize that I've created an app recently, right, which is a collaborative CAP, where there's an array of things where I leverage on technological aspects. So for example, intra-group. So there will be a group that is participating, right? There'll be another group which is participating. After this group have done their discussion, it is kind of swapped over among groups. So it's an intra-group aspect. Now, the functionality also allows them to ask questions. For example, in the mobile phone, they can type in their questions after you cover a concept. They can type in the questions in 4 categories. They can ask a question, they can clarify, they can add on points, they can give comments. And there are many other features. So 3 things just to sum up. Number 1 is case study that I use, and as an example, I've explained that. Role play, for example, right? Number 3, technology aspect intervening. Last one, if I may add on, just to push the boundary a bit more, is service learning, community, right? I try to bring them out of the classroom to do service learning. And this needs some preparation, of course, but I try to take that into what I call as fieldwork report. They have a fieldwork report, and they tend to go out at least once or twice to interview people or to do some work outside the classroom.
Well, thank you. Yes. So you talked about role play. So you must be leveraging on your own experience when you do that, your own experience in industry. How about for teachers who might not have had that kind of experience? Because some teachers, they teach communication on business courses, but they might not necessarily have that industry background. Do you see that as a problem, or can people still develop and facilitate role play type activities?
Yeah, excellent question, Mark. I appreciate you asking this. Now, in my opinion, my personal opinion, I don't think this is a big hindrance. The reason why I say that is because we can always, the whole spirit of role play is that it can be fictitious at times, right? We can create a scenario. But let's understand the underlying reason or push for role play is the ability in terms of communication, for example. I mean, talk from the management communication point of view, where you may want to find some challenges. Let me give you a bigger aspect. Some challenges that you think that the students need to perhaps focus on, maybe articulation, clarity, for example, right? That there's management communication, right? How do you get to an interview and kind of convince and negotiate, perhaps? Now, these are things that we can actually create, and I think that's one aspect. Now, some of the things that we do, and probably I want to share here as well, so that it's beneficial for your faculty, especially in the language and communication department, is talk to practitioners. I'm very sure that there are management communicators out there. If you think that you probably need some sort of flavor, right? Maybe some sort of ideas, right? Perhaps what is happening out there. Now, I think it's over a cup of coffee. That's about it. A couple of touch points. And there you go. You can create a fictitious kind of a case scenario, and you get them do it. Now, the important thing, I think, for communication is the ability of us to make them practice. Now, of course, you must have, I'm very sure, our colleagues will be able to do that in terms of learning outcomes of what are you focusing on. But the storyline is something that we want to make it something relating to the industry, because today, as you know, students are very exposed out there. So I think talking to practitioners, perhaps doing some search and research on that would help, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So in the book, you towards the beginning of the book, you talk about the educator having different roles. So you talk about role model, mentor, coach, and facilitator. So a very complex identity. Is it possible to simultaneously have all of these roles, or is one teacher going to be more of one than the other?
Yeah, fantastic question. And let me try to address that. And in my book, I've covered 4 rules. Obviously, there could be more rules. But I think in today's environment, as an educator, we need to understand we take on different roles at different situations. For example, you are in classroom. What are 1 or 2 roles that you want to participate in that lesson, for example? Perhaps beyond that, you must be able to take on different roles. Let me touch the different roles. Number 1, you need to be a mentor. So mentor, the class is really about the expertise. You are a language educator, you know deep down what you're doing research, and you've been teaching that for very, very long. For example, communication, that's mentor, right? People look up to you, students come to you because you're an expert in that aspect. You tend to mentor, and there are different styles of mentoring, right? So that's mentorship. And we do that in classroom and outside the classroom. Then there is this role of coach. Now, coach is the ability to understand the strengths and weaknesses by and large of a student and try to be able to intervene. And when I say intervene, this is very important, because how do you give feedback? Very simple. Give feedback to a cluster of group of students who are weaker than the other. We want everyone to run, but we know that there will be people who are actually falling back. But it's our responsibility, if we take on the role of a coach, of how do we guide these people to level up, maybe not as speedily as those people are running very fast, but making sure that they don't fall back. So that's coach, inside and outside the classroom. Facilitator, right? When you facilitate, you don't want to get involved too much. And that's where the student-centric comes into place. Right? We tend to facilitate that in the class. For example, in class, you want to make sure that their power is shifted to the students, give them a voice, right? Collectively, their perspective may reach a particular solution. Right? And then we, as facilitator, we're going to guide you. We're not going to tell you what and how the answer is. So that part comes in very important as well. So this different roles allows the educator to shift. And we need to do that today, because the dynamism of education and learning has changed.
Thank you. Yes. Another very interesting aspect of the book is when you talk about effective ways to develop reflective peer review feedback. This is something that a lot of the teachers here at CELC work on, trying to develop students' abilities to give peer review. Have you got any advice for developing that?
Sure. Now, I appreciate and glad to hear our colleagues there at your Center, Language and Communication, is doing quite a great work on that. Perhaps in my opinion and my reflections, as well as what I've done, perhaps some couple of pointers for our colleagues to reflect about. Perhaps they may have done it, or perhaps how they can push even further. Now, one of the things that I realized in peer review is that the process of peer review has to be very rigorous, right? So what I tend to do is that, for example, let me give you an example, peer review within a group. So I give them an activity, right? It could be 45 minutes, for example, 30 minutes, for example. And because I'm doing leadership management, change management, organization development topics, and I think it's very related to communication, perhaps in some way, where when they actually does that, after that, I'm actually trying to make sure that the competency and skill of that leader, of the group members, whatever roles that they are taking on, is reflected to them. For example, let me give you a very specific example. Today's topic is about goal setting. Okay, so this activity goes for 45 minutes, and we want one person in that group to be reviewed by the 4 of them. Okay, how does he set goal setting as from a leader's point of view? Now, at the end of the peer review, at the end of the activity, all the group members would tend to review this particular person on a certain specific criteria. Now, what am I doing? At the end of the day, he go back with some formative feedback, collective feedback. One of them is saying, okay, you score 6, and why you score 6? Another person will say you score 4, and this is my perspective. I don't agree with that guy, but this is my perspective. Now, why is this important? This is very important because in the real world, there's no template, right? People come with different opinions. People come with different baggages. People come and look at you in different opinions. But that is exactly what is needed as a leader. You must be able to address different perspectives. You may not agree with them. You can agree to disagree, but you still have to address that. Now, so that aspect of peer review and the rigorous process of making sure that this person gets the feedback, he reflects on the feedback, and there must be a closure. A lot of time we do peer review, and it stops there, right? The person is wondering, okay, I'm thinking about my feedback, which you've given me. How am I going to improve? So what I do is to close the loop, right? So this is activity number 1. And when they come to the next lesson, the person who is given the feedback has to reflect. And then he has to come to the class and talk about whether he agrees, he disagrees, what he intends to do. And by that, the peers listen, the whole class listens, and there is this aspect of closure. I think, in my humble opinion, the closure is something that I find it as a gap in most, if not all, right? Where we may want to work on the closure so that we know that this particular person got what he or she, the student, got him. Now, of course, this needs some time, but I think we can do it creatively today in different ways. We may not want to do it every week, but we can do it in such a way that there is this loop of closure. That's what I'm saying.
Yes, I'm sure that last loop, that last element of the loop is not really that often introduced. Is this part of what you might say an element of your work on developing a mindset for lifelong learning, is being able to, listen to feedback and react to feedback? Is this an important element for students to learn for later on, for future work-ready students?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think this is a very timely question, in my opinion. I feel the reason why I say that is because lifelong learning, be it for educators like ourselves, as well as students, applies the same, in my opinion. The reason why I say that is because it needs 2 hands to clap, right? So number 1, let's talk about our students, our stakeholders, one of the stakeholders. Now, they has to be ingrained this value where education doesn't finish after 3 years or 4 years. It is about the ability of every lesson is a learning process beyond classroom, beyond your graduation. And that's what I try to aspire. I hope I'm able to touch students on that aspect. That's number 1. So I ingrain values in whatever I do. And I try to make that as a process, is never a perfect template. Now, for educators, I think it's even more important because we are the frontline leaders in our own rights, in our own classroom. So it is important for us to be able to have that mindset, growth mindset, and agility and humility. I think very important, let me emphasize that, to know that we don't know everything, right? And I think that has to come in actions rather than thinking. So how do we do that in actions? Review our own through our peers. I think it's an excellent platform today. We get together, we talk in conferences, maybe go back and reflect. And how can we fine tune if it is not a major transformation, a radical transformation? How do we fine tune? What are some of the contemporary things that is happening out there that we can try to bring it into our own learning design? It may not be everything. We may not agree with everything. But I think the important thing is about how do we learn, what is beneficial for my course so that I can value add to my students. What can we even learn from our students? And one of the things is about the student-centric transfer. You'll be amazed that how well students can transform the teaching and learning as well. Right? If we can do that and we walk on the pathway, be it whatever specialization, right? We are in language school, communication colleagues, or business school or law, I think it applies across every different specialization, in my opinion.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. I'd like to finish with a very interesting element that you wrote in your book in the preface. So you write that students are truly learning when they experience discomfort in the progress or are put in an ambiguous situation while working towards resolving an assigned task. So this idea of experiencing discomfort in their learning. So is this related to challenging them and pushing them out of their comfort zones? Do you think that that's really important?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think the concept of Manipur, that aspect of, they have looked into the specifically on learning design as one aspect. But I think my advocate is to go beyond that, perhaps. And let me explain what I meant by what I said in my preface. Now, I'm a staunch believer that there's no gain without kind of a pain, and you can put it in a different context. What do I mean by that? Now, in order for someone to learn, they are required to have they are required behaviorally through learning design, right, in different contexts. And it goes beyond that in complexity, right? And when I do that, they tend to get stuck and they start thinking. Now, the moment you get discomfort means that you don't know the answers, for example, right? You behaviorally, you try to reach out to people who are experts or mentors or coach or your peers. You start. So that is learning, because even that needs some skill set. Why must I give you the knowledge? You must be able to negotiate with people. You must be able to convince people. You must be able to have that characteristic that people want to help you. So that is learning, right? That's exactly what is needed in the real world. At the same time, in learning, when you get not comfortable, it means that you stop there and you start finding information in different ways. So you seek information, you think about it. Now, that ambiguity has to come in some level. Right? I'm not saying that they have to be given the totality, and we can do that. I've tried that in an unstructured manner, but you need to have that kind of time and bandwidth to do that. Right? What we can do is certain percentage of this comes into place, and I do that in my pedagogical design in some way. And this is kind of discomfort for them, but when they are in discomfort, they are being pushed forward in terms of learning because they tend to find out things. And then finally, when they get kind of the solution, if I may say, they are a better person, a better individual, because they have learned from different perspectives. Obviously, we are there to support with kind of the final aspect.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So, you know, there have been some very interesting topics brought up there today. And I think that everyone's going to, you know, benefit considerably from reading the book and applying a lot of the ideas from the book in their own teaching. So thank you very much, Kumaran, for agreeing to, you know, to do this interview with us.
Right. Thank you very much, Mark, for the invitation. I'm glad and I'm happy to share my insights. And I think the whole advocate, or probably at least from me, is to share what I've done in terms of research, my experiences, so that many of the other colleagues would probably look at it and perhaps, it eventually would benefit them, I hope. Right. So thank you very much, Mark, and on behalf of your center as for inviting for this interview. It's been great.
Thank you, Kumaran.